The courtroom was packed, filled with spectators eager to witness what was expected to be a routine legal proceeding. Attorneys shuffled their papers, reporters adjusted their microphones, and a few political analysts whispered among themselves. Yet there was a strange energy in the air. Something was different about this case. It wasn't just another day in court, it was a clash of ideologies, a moment where power and influence would be put to the test. Karoline Leavitt entered the Ayakbao room with the kind of confidence that turned heads. She wasn't just another political figure. She was a force to be reckoned with, known for her unwavering principles and fearless approach to truth. She had faced adversity before, but today, something felt off. There was a tension in the air, a subtle hostility that made even the most seasoned observers take note. The moment the session began, it became clear that the legal proceeding was not going to be fair. The atmosphere shifted as the tone became less about justice and more about intimidation. The questions, rather than being neutral, were laced with condescension. The manner in which they were asked carried an underlying implication, an attempt to corner her, to make her stumble, to turn the narrative against her. The audience watched as she remained composed, unwavering in her demeanor. Every attempt to rattle her was met with an unshakable resolve. She answered each question with clarity, making it evident that she had come prepared. The frustration in the room was almost palpable. It was clear that the goal was to make her appear weak, uncertain, or flustered. But instead, she remained poised, her expression one of quiet confidence. The line of questioning grew increasingly aggressive, shifting from legal matters to pointed remarks that had little to do with the case at hand. It was an obvious tactic, a calculated effort to put her on the defensive. The comments, while subtle enough to seem professional on the surface, carried an unmistakable tone of disdain. It was an attempt to assert dominance, to diminish her credibility through insinuation rather than facts. A few members of the audience exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that this was no longer about the legal matter in question. This was personal. It was a deliberate effort to frame her in a certain light, to push a narrative that had been crafted long before she even stepped into the courtroom. The more composed she remained, the more the hostility seemed to intensify. Despite the clear bias, she never wavered. Her responses were sharp, direct, and rooted in undeniable facts. Each attempt to mischaracterize her was met with an articulate rebuttal, dismantling the flawed reasoning behind the accusations. With every response, it became increasingly clear that she was not someone who could be easily intimidated. The frustration in the room grew. It was evident that the original strategy was failing. The usual tactics weren't working. Instead of appearing defensive or uncertain, she was turning the tables, exposing the flaws in the arguments being presented against her. The audience watched as she systematically broke down every false narrative, refusing to be manipulated into a response that could be twisted against her. There was a shift in the atmosphere as those present began to take notice. What had started as an attempt to discredit her was now turning into something else entirely. Instead of weakening her position, the situation was only reinforcing what many already knew. She was not easily swayed by pressure, nor was she afraid to stand her ground when faced with blatant attempts to undermine her. The exchange continued. Each attempt to control the conversation met with resistance. She refused to allow the setting to dictate the narrative. Instead, she steered the conversation back to the facts, ensuring that the focus remained on the truth rather than the distractions being thrown her way. The audience, once merely observers, now watched with growing interest. Some had entered the room expecting a routine proceeding. Others had anticipated a spectacle. But what they were witnessing was something far more significant. It was a demonstration of resilience in the face of an orchestrated effort to silence someone who refused to be silenced. The attempt to intimidate her was failing, and it was evident that those behind the effort were beginning to realize it. The original plan had relied on the assumption that she would falter, that she would react emotionally, that she would make a misstep that could be used against her. But instead, she was proving to be more formidable than they had anticipated. The frustration in the room became impossible to ignore. It was written on the faces of those who had expected a different outcome. The dynamic had shifted. What had begun as an attempt to undermine her had turned into an opportunity for her to showcase exactly why she was such a formidable presence. The exchange continued, each moment revealing more about the true nature of the situation. Those present could see what was happening. They could see the tactics being used, and they could see that despite every effort to diminish her, she was only becoming stronger. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, but she remained steady. The questions, designed to unnerve her, barely made a dent in her confidence. Every syllable was calculated to create doubt, to twist her words, to make her stumble. But she had spent too long in the public arena to be caught off guard by such predictable tactics. She listened intently, allowing the words to fully settle before responding. There was no rush, no flustered reaction, no sign of intimidation. If anything, she seemed more in control of the moment than those who had intended to break her composure. Her expression remained unreadable, her body language unwavering. With a deliberate pause, she leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension in the room with sharp precision. There was no need to raise her tone or resort to theatrics. Her words alone were enough to shift the energy in the space. She pointed out the inconsistency, the blatant disregard for fairness, the carefully veiled attempts to twist the situation into something it was not. The audience watched as she turned the exchange on its head. The attempt to put her on the defensive had backfired. Instead of being cornered, she was now the one in control, steering the discussion back to the undeniable facts that had been conveniently ignored. The points she made were not just compelling, they were irrefutable. The tension in the room thickened as she exposed the underlying bias, peeling back the layers of rhetoric to reveal the truth underneath. It was not done with anger or hostility, but with a calm certainty that made it impossible to dismiss her words. She didn't need to over-explain. She simply let the facts speak for themselves, knowing they were powerful enough on their own. The silence that followed each statement was deafening. It was clear that the strategy had been to provoke her, to make her react in a way that could be used against her. But instead, she had remained composed, methodically dismantling every misleading assertion with the kind of clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. As the discussion continued, the frustration in the air became palpable. The original plan had been to force her into a position of weakness, but she had done the exact opposite. Each answer she gave carried weight, cutting through the noise and forcing those in the room to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth. She was right, and they knew it. A few members of the audience exchanged glances, sensing the shift in momentum. What had started as an attempt to undermine her was now becoming something else entirely. She was not just holding her ground, she was winning this exchange. The very tactics meant to diminish her had only made her stronger. She never once raised her voice, never once allowed emotion to dictate her words. That was what made her so formidable. While others relied on spectacle and theatrics, she relied on truth. And when truth is spoken with conviction, it has a way of silencing even the loudest voices in the room. Her confidence was not arrogance, it was certainty. She knew the facts, and she knew the truth was on her side. No amount of manipulation could change that. She had prepared for this moment, not because she feared the challenge, but because she understood exactly how these situations played out. She had seen it before, and she knew how to handle it. The air in the room shifted as realization set in. This was not someone who could be easily outmaneuvered. This was someone who had spent years honing her ability to see through deception. Someone who had faced opposition before and emerged stronger every time. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty from those who had expected her to falter. They had underestimated her, assumed she would crumble under pressure. But instead, she had taken their own tactics and turned them into a lesson on what happens when you attempt to silence someone who refuses to be silenced. She took a measured breath before delivering the final blow to their argument, a single statement so undeniably clear that even those who had hoped to see her fail had no choice but to acknowledge the strength of her words. The weight of the truth she had just spoken settled over the room, leaving no space for rebuttal. The audience sat in stunned silence, watching as she reclaimed the moment with effortless ease. This was not someone to be dismissed, not someone who could be manipulated or controlled. She had come prepared, and she had just proven why she was a force to be reckoned with. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the atmosphere grew thick with tension. The exchange had taken an unexpected turn, shifting from a calculated attempt at humiliation to something much more precarious. What was meant to be a routine display of control had instead become an unraveling of carefully constructed deception. The spectators sensed it before it even fully unfolded, the weight of truth pressing against the walls of the room, inching closer to an inevitable revelation. Karoline. Leavitt remained calm, her expression unreadable. She had not entered this space unprepared, nor had she underestimated what she was up against. She had seen the signs from the moment she stepped inside, the forced confidence, the overplayed authority, the barely concealed arrogance that came from years of unchecked power. But she also knew that arrogance often blinded people to their own vulnerabilities. She reached for a folder, her movements deliberate, and flipped it open. The room fell silent. There was no need for theatrics, no need for dramatic gestures. The weight of what she was about to reveal would speak for itself. Single piece of paper. That was all it took. She held it up for a moment, allowing the significance of the document to sink in. The carefully curated narrative that had been built over time began to show its first cracks. The words printed on that page were not speculation. They were not opinion. They were evidence. Hard, undeniable proof of a reality that had long been hidden beneath layers of deceit. The shift in the air was immediate. A few people in the audience sat forward, eyes locked on the paper as if trying to decipher its meaning from a distance. Others exchanged glances, sensing the sudden vulnerability now exposed before them. The ones who had once exuded confidence now seemed tense, uncertain. She didn't rush. She allowed the silence to stretch, knowing the weight of the moment would only grow heavier with each passing second. Then, with a calm and measured voice, she began to read. The words were clear, precise, and damning. They revealed a pattern of behavior that could no longer be dismissed as rumor or conspiracy. The numbers didn't lie. The signatures at the bottom of the page didn't lie. The evidence was airtight, a web of transactions and connections that painted an undeniable picture of corruption, deceit, and abuse of power. A murmur rippled through the room as the realization spread. Some had suspected for years that something wasn't right, but suspicion was one thing, proof was another. And now, the proof was right there in black and white, laid out before them without room for interpretation. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The weight of the truth was heavy, pressing down on those who had spent so long believing in the illusion of integrity. This wasn't just an embarrassing revelation, it was a seismic shift in perception. She placed the paper down and looked. Around the room, her gaze unwavering. There was no smugness in her expression, no satisfaction in proving what she had already known to be true. There was only a quiet certainty, a steadiness that came from standing firmly on the side of truth. Few reporters scrambled to take notes, their pens scratching against their notepads with urgency. This was not the story they had expected to cover today. Some of them had come prepared to write about an entirely different narrative, one that now seemed laughable in the face of what had just been exposed. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The once commanding presence that had sought to control the room just moments ago now seemed diminished, stripped of its authority by the sheer power of undeniable truth. The illusion had shattered, and there was no putting it back together. Then came the voices, the hushed conversations between observers, the clicking of cameras as photographers captured the moment, the hurried whispers of aides who suddenly realized the gravity of what had just been revealed. This was not something that could be ignored. This was not something that could be spun into another narrative. This was real, and it was happening right in front of them. As she remained standing, her posture strong and resolute, it became clear that this was more than just an exchange of words. This was a reckoning, and the fallout was only just beginning. A stunned silence filled the courtroom, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. The realization had sunk in. This was no longer just a tense exchange, no longer a battle of words or ideology. The situation had shifted entirely, veering into territory that no one had anticipated. The once assured figure at the center of the controversy now sat motionless, as if frozen by the sheer gravity of what had just transpired. The authority that had once been wielded so effortlessly had vanished, replaced by a quiet, suffocating panic. There was no way to argue against the truth that had been laid bare. No way to dismiss it, no way to sidestep the consequences. The eye. Officers moved with a quiet efficiency, their presence commanding yet emotionless. They had been waiting for this moment, prepared for what needed to be done. The paperwork had already been processed, the steps already set in motion long before the final revelation had even been spoken aloud. This wasn't a decision made in the heat of the moment. It was the inevitable result of actions that could no longer be ignored. A few members of the audience leaned forward, their eyes locked onto the scene unfolding before them. Some had expected a confrontation, a final act of defiance, but there was none. Instead, there was only shock, disbelief, and the slow, dawning realization that the consequences were real, immediate, and inescapable. The room remained eerily still as the process began. A pair of cuffs, a simple gesture, yet carrying the full weight of justice. The unmistakable sound of metal locking into place seemed to echo far louder than it should have, sending a ripple through the crowd. Those who had once stood in quiet support now shrank back, distancing themselves from what had once seemed like unshakable power. The moment stretched, heavy with meaning. Those who had once spoken with certainty now had nothing to say. Those who had watched in quiet apprehension now bore witness to the turning of the tide. It was a scene that would be remembered for years to come, a reminder that no matter how long injustice goes unchecked, the truth always finds its way to the surface. The eyes of the spectators followed as the walk toward the exit began. There was no grand speech, no last attempt to control the narrative. There was only silence, broken only by the soft shuffle of feet against the polished floor. A few flashes from cameras punctuated the stillness, capturing an image that would soon spread far beyond the walls of the courtroom. As the doors swung open, the world beyond waited. Reporters, camera crews, citizens who had been following every detail of the case, all standing ready to witness the final outcome. The weight of public scrutiny was unavoidable now, a force stronger than any individual influence. The figure being led away did not turn back, did not look around for sympathy or support. There was nowhere left to turn, nowhere left to hide from the consequences of long-buried truths. The people who had once offered unwavering loyalty now looked on in stunned silence, realizing that the foundation they had believed in had crumbled beneath them. Karoline Leavitt remained still, watching as justice took its course. There was no need for celebration, no need for words. The truth had spoken for itself, and in the end, that was all that had ever been needed. The air in the courtroom remained thick with an unshakable sense of finality. What had started as an attempt to humiliate and control had ended in disgrace, not for Karoline Leavitt, but for the one who had tried to silence her. The balance of power had shifted, not through force, not through manipulation, but through the undeniable weight of truth. For those who had watched the events unfold, it was a moment of reckoning. Many had entered the room expecting yet another example of power being wielded without consequence, of corruption hiding behind a veil of authority. Instead, they had witnessed something rare, justice, swift and absolute. Reporters scrambled to document what had just transpired, their hurried notes and flashing cameras capturing the fall of a once untouchable figure. It was a moment that would be replayed across news channels, dissected in articles, and remembered as a warning to those who believed they could abuse their power indefinitely. The reality was undeniable. No one, no matter how powerful they seemed, was beyond the reach of accountability. No amount of posturing, no carefully crafted narrative, no desperate attempt to twist the facts could change what had happened. The system had finally worked as it was meant to, and the weight of that realization settled over the room like an unspoken truth. Karoline Leavitt stood firm, unwavering in the face of it all. She had not come seeking revenge, nor had she sought personal victory. Her only goal had been to speak the truth, to stand against injustice, and to ensure that no one could use their position to trample over the rights of others without consequence. As the doors closed behind the disgraced figure, the world outside erupted. The waiting crowds, the journalists eager for a statement, the supporters who had held their breath through every moment of the trial, all of them now bore witness to the reality that had just unfolded. And while the cameras flashed and the questions began, Karoline Leavitt knew that this was about something far greater than one person or one case. It was about integrity, about standing firm even when the odds seemed insurmountable. It was about proving that truth, no matter how long it takes to surface, will always prevail in the end. There would be those who tried to rewrite the narrative, those who sought to downplay what had happened. But the images, the testimony, and the undeniable facts would remain. The world had seen what true accountability looked like, and it was a sight not easily forgotten. As she stepped forward, prepared to face the questions that would inevitably come, one thing was certain. This was not just the end of a case. It was the beginning of a new era, one where corruption would no longer be met with silence, where justice would no longer be a mere illusion. It was a moment that would echo for years to come, a reminder that no matter how powerful the opposition, the truth will always